They called me a witch. In a language I didn't understand, the word sounded like murderer. That day, I lost my freedom and my faith in God's silence. I fled the war with my baby and my sewing machine. In America, I thought I had found a miracle, a Christian refuge. But the gift that sewed hope into the rags of other refugees was what they used to imprison me. The shelter director held her son's cold body, pointed at me, and my miracle became my curse. My name is Elina. In my homeland, my grandmother taught me that the blue thread wasn't cotton. It was a conductor, a thread of faith connecting pain to grace. When I sewed for the other women at the shelter, I didn't just join fabrics. I sewed my prayers. I cried over the cotton, asking for healing. And sometimes miracles happened. Women who couldn't speak found their voice. They said I sewed prayers. But in this new world, miracles are suspect. When the director's baby fell ill, she asked me for a special outfit. I used the purest blue thread. I wept my deepest prayers for that child's health. But she didn't survive. A mother's desperate love turned to hatred. Poison, they shouted. Toxic products. My silence, the silence of someone who doesn't know how to defend themselves in the accuser's language, was my confession. No one sought the truth. I am serving a life sentence. The sound of the sewing machines in the workshop is a mockery. The other prisoners look at me with fear. The baby killer. My gift has dried up. My faith is a scar. I have spent years in this cell, where the only light is a cold rectangle on the wall, trying to understand how the thread of faith became the rope of my execution. Human justice quickly condemns what it does not understand. Years later, a volunteer reopened my case. He wasn't looking for poison. He was searching for the truth. In the old tissue, kept as evidence, he found what my soul knew. It wasn't poison. It was human tears. The gift was real. Now, the same miracle that condemned me may be the only key to my redemption. We want to know where this story is touching hearts. This is a profound journey about faith and injustice, and how my divine gift was distorted by fear. If you believe that truth, however long it takes, always finds the light, you're in the right place. I ask that you join our community of souls. Your enrollment supports narratives of redemption that the world prefers to forget. Enjoy. By watching this video, you help me bring this voice to other people who may be going through their own silent battles. My story is about a blue thread, a fragile symbol of intertwined faith and pain. We want to hear from you. What is the blue thread in your life? Leave your comment below with your thoughts, or simply tell us which city or country you are watching from. Get ready. My journey to freedom begins now. You'll discover that the hardest prison to escape isn't made of bars, but of secrets. And what was hidden in that fabric will change everything. The plastic of the van seat was icy, colder than the metal of the handcuffs. I looked out the barred window, but I didn't see the city. I only saw the distorted reflection of my own face, a mask of disbelief I didn't recognize. The trial was a blur. A grim theater in a language I only mastered enough to understand the horror of the words they hurled at me. Poison. Witchcraft. Murderer. I wanted to scream that the only poison was their fear, that the only witchcraft was the faith my grandmother taught me to weave with blue thread. But my voice was lost in the labyrinth of translation, in the empty gaze of the shelter director. She no longer cried for her son. She only watched me be consumed by the fire of her grief, and didn't move a muscle to save me. America, the land of freedom, had become my worst prison, long before I saw the bars. The sound of my boots hitting the concrete corridor was hollow, an echo that seemed to say, "There's no turning back." The smell hit me first, a sour mixture of disinfectant, old sweat, and something metallic, like the smell of a forgotten iron pot on the stove. A guard, her face impassive as stone, shouted a number. Inmate 944582, strip, shower, uniform. Prisoner 94582, take off your clothes, shower, uniform. That was the moment. The moment Elina died and the prisoner was born. They didn't just take my clothes, they took my name. In the communal shower, the cold water didn't wash away the dirt of the trial. It only deepened the cold in my bones. The orange uniform they gave me was rough, hard. It felt like it was made of sandpaper and shame. As I walked down the main corridor, the other women's stares were like knives, some with pity, others with contempt, most with an indifference that was, perhaps, the worst of all. "Look at the newcomer," one of them hissed. "The baby killer." The metal door slammed shut with a final sound, a clang that sealed my fate. The sound of the key turning in the lock. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of justice growing deaf. I stood in the middle of the tiny cell, a metal bed, a sink, a toilet. The cold fluorescent light buzzed, covering everything with a pale, sickly glow. I touched the wall, peeling paint on cold concrete. I sat on the hard bed, the mattress as thin as paper. They had taken everything from me. My baby, my sewing machine, my bag of thread. They took my blue yarn. How could I pray now? How could I ask God for a miracle when He allowed my greatest blessing to be called a curse? I looked at my hands, empty, and then a chilling realization washed over me. The real trial wasn't over. They hadn't just locked me in here. They had locked the miracle in here with me. They thought they were burying a secret, but what they didn't know is that sometimes faith needs the deepest darkness to sprout. The first night was the longest of my life. The prison lights never completely go out. They only dim to a sickly gray glow, bright enough for the cameras to see, but not enough to warm the soul. I discovered that the prison's silence isn't silence. It's a living organism. It's the sound of 100 women breathing in cramped cells, the echo of a dry cough from the corridor, the muffled sob of someone in the bottom bunk trying to hide their pain in the thin pillow. My cellmate, an older woman with eyes that held a century of exhaustion, said nothing. She just turned to the wall, a gesture that was both armor and a sentence. I huddled under the thin blanket, which smelled of bleach and a faint hint of mildew, the smell of institutionalized hopelessness. I closed my eyes, and the image of my baby, the baby taken from me at the border, flooded my mind. That one. Loss, and then the principal's baby. The betrayal. I tried to pray, but the words seemed hollow, hitting the cold concrete and returning empty. "God," I whispered in the dark, "you gave me a miracle, and now you have thrown me into this place. Where is your justice?" The only answer was the hum of the security light and the distant sound of keys clinking against metal. The awakening was violent. Not a gentle alarm, but the shrill sound of metal doors being unlocked electronically, a clang that vibrated in my chest. "Count!" The guard's voice was impersonal, worn out. We were herded like cattle to the mess hall. The noise was a solid wall. The dragging of boots, the clatter of plastic trays, hundreds of voices competing in a deafening echo. The smell of burnt coffee and something resembling oatmeal filled the air. I sat at the only empty table, my shoulders hunched, trying to become invisible. It didn't work. A corpulent woman, with red hair tied in tight braids, stopped in front of me, blocking the light. She was the leader of that sector, the mother of the cell, in the most distorted sense of the word. "You're the newbie," she said, her voice low and harsh. The baby killer. The cafeteria didn't fall silent, but a circle of silence formed around us. "You gonna face me, newbie?" she growled. I lowered my eyes. Fear was a bitter taste in my mouth. "I don't—" "Shut up before they knock you out," she hissed. "Here, we don't like people who hurt children. You're nothing." She spat on the floor near my feet and walked away. The food on my tray tasted like poison. I was an outcast among outcasts. I spent the rest of the day locked in my cell during free time because the yard looked like a lion's den, and I was the wounded prey. I sat on the bunk, my heart pounding erratically. Betrayal. The director's words hurt, but this was different. It was the rejection of my own kind, of the women who should understand pain. The label baby killer was ink that wouldn't come off, a second skin of shame. I looked at my trembling hands. The hands that once stitched miracles, now useless, empty. I remembered my grandmother in our war-torn village. She saw me cry once and placed my hands on hers. "Elina," she said, "God doesn't need silk or blue thread. He only needs your pain. The thread is just the path where the prayer goes. But prayer is born in the fingers." A breath of air entered my lungs. Prayer, they took my machine. They took my lines. They took my name. But they didn't take my fingers. They didn't take my tears. And they didn't take my memory. Only later did I realize the real trial hadn't even begun yet. My redemption, it wouldn't come from a judge or a lawyer. It would have to be stitched together, right here, in Thessalon's, from this cell, using the only wires they couldn't confiscate from me. A Faith, she wasn't dead. She was just asleep, waiting for the right needle. The days began to merge into a long, gray stain. Time in prison doesn't pass. It leaks away, like water from a cracked pipe. Routine was the only anchor, and it was a cold iron anchor. Forest in the morning, the clang from the doors. 4:05 in the morning, the hum of fluorescent lights. 4:30 in the morning, the countdown. We had to stand beside our beds, hands visible, while a guard passed by, his face a mask of boredom, murmuring numbers. 9, 4, 5, 8, 2. I was no longer Elina. I was a digit in a ledger of lost souls. The smell of disinfectant and weak coffee became the perfume of my existence. The silence, what I so longed for, was impossible. There was always the sound of keys, the echo of footsteps on the concrete, the static of the guard's radio. It was a silence full of noise, a silence who screamed that I was buried alive, a constant reminder of my loss. My job assignment landed me in the laundry, a hell of hot steam and bleach smell. But to get there, I had to pass through the sewing workshop. The first time, my heart stopped. Through the wire-paned glass window, I saw them, rows and rows of women bent over industrial sewing machines, their hum a familiar sound that now felt like torture. They were making uniforms, sheets, flags, soulless work, prayerless sewing. The redhead who threatened me, Red, was there, overseeing her little fiefdom. Her eyes met mine through the glass. She made a slow gesture with her finger, cutting her own throat. I hurried, the sound of the machines following me down the hallway. This was deliberate punishment. They knew my story. They put me where I could see what I'd lost, but never touch. This prison, she not only confined the body, she was an expert at crippling the soul, at rubbing it, loss in your face until you can't breathe anymore. I didn't cry. Tears seemed like a luxury, a weakness I couldn't afford. My cellmate, whose name I learned was Maria, still hadn't said a word to me. She spent her nights reading a Bible with a worn cover, her lips moving in silent prayers. She never offered them to me. I was the untouchable one, the witch. That night, lying on the top bunk, the hum of the lights outside, the smell of metal and dust, I closed my eyes. The image of my blue thread came to mind. The feel of the cotton, the right tension, the way it glided through the needle. I raised my right hand in the dark. I moved my thumb and forefinger together, a ghostly movement, pulling an invisible thread from the air. I began to sew. I sewed the rough blanket. I sewed the cold concrete of the wall. I sewed my memories. I sewed my grandmother's prayer. May the pain find its purpose. May the thread not break. My fingers moved insolence from the cell, quick and precise. I didn't need a machine. I didn't need a line. My faith, it was in my hands. The worst cell was the one I built myself. And if I built it in despair, perhaps I could undo it, stitch by stitch, with hope, proving that my redemption, it didn't depend on their rules. Weeks turned into months. The initial shock hardened and became a scar. I became a ghost in the general population. I learned the rhythms of prison. I learned to walk with my head down, to avoid eye contact, to blend into the shadows on the walls. The smell of bleach and metal was now just the smell of home. My ghost stitching became my nightly ritual, my only way of faith, The other prisoners who had seen me fidgeting in the cafeteria or courtyard now gave me space. "Here comes the crazy witch," they whispered, "the baby killer who lost his mind." The irony was cruel. The same label that condemned me now gave me a shield. The perceived madness was a form of privacy. In the cell, Maria, my companion, continued her silence. She watched me stitch the air together every night, her eyes following my fingers, no longer with judgment, but with a deep and cautious curiosity. Then a new girl arrived on our block. Sarah. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her arms were covered in marks, her eyes sunken and terrified. She was in withdrawal, and her screams at night were a soul-rending sound. It wasn't a cry of sadness. It was a scream of pure terror, a loss so deep it made her teeth ache. The other prisoners yelled at her to shut up. The guards ignored her. The sound of an addict's pain was just another noise in the symphony of hell. But that night, her cry was different. It was the sound of something breaking forever. I sat on my bunk, my heart heavy. That sound, I recognized it. It was the same texture of pain I felt at the border. It was the same frequency of despair I tried to stitch together to heal the warden's baby. I closed my eyes. I raised my hands in the cold air of the cell. Maria, on the bunk below, held her breath. I began to stitch, not for myself, for Sarah. I imagined a thread. This time, it wasn't my grandmother's blue thread. It was a thread of golden light, warm, like the sun in my village. In my mind, I pulled it from my own chest, a line of faith pure and painful. I began stitching the air toward Sarah's cell. My fingers moved with an urgency I hadn't felt in years. I stitched through the concrete and steel. I stitched the silence around the sound of her screams. I imagined I was mending the torn edges of her soul, pulling the stitches tightly, closing the wounds opened by drugs and fear. I stitched for an hour, maybe 2. My shoulders burned. My fingers were numb, as if they had actually pushed a needle through thick leather. And then it happened. The desperate crying subsided. It became a sob. Then a trembling sigh. And finally, silence. A real peaceful silence enveloped the block. I lowered my hands, exhausted, my body trembling. And then, from the bunk below, I heard a voice, a rough whisper, like sandpaper. "What? What did you do?" Maria was sitting, looking at me in the gray twilight, her eyes wide with astonishment and something I hadn't seen in a long time. Fear. And reverence, miracle. It didn't need fabric. And for the first time, someone had seen it. I looked at Maria, my heart pounding in my throat. The air in the cell was thick, heavy with the weight of that question. "What did you do?" Silence. From Sarah's cell was the answer. I tried to find the words in English, but they were heavy and awkward. I prayed," I whispered, knowing it was a half-truth. Maria shook her head slowly, her eyes, once dull with decades of exhaustion, now terribly alive. "No," she whispered back, her voice a secret in the dark. "I pray every night. My prayers bounce off this wall and fall to the floor. What you did went through the stone." She looked at my hands, which now rested in my lap. "They call you a witch, but what I saw wasn't witchcraft. It was something else." She didn't say the word. Miracle. She didn't need to. Fear gripped me. Betrayal. The director's conversation started like this, with admiration that soured and turned into accusation. I stepped away, an instinctive movement of protection. "I just sewed," I murmured. "It's all I know how to do." The next morning, the change was immediate. When I entered the cafeteria, the usual noise seemed to subside. Sarah, the new girl, was there. She looked exhausted, pale, but her eyes were clear for the first time. As I passed her table, she raised her head and our eyes met. There was no gratitude there, not yet. There was confusion, fear, and a terrified respect. But the real shock came from Maria. For the first time, she didn't wait for me or ignore me. She walked slowly and deliberately by my side in the breakfast line. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible to most. But in the geopolitics of prison, it was an earthquake. It was a statement. When Red, the red-haired leader, saw us, her usual mocking smile faltered. She watched Maria pick up her tray and sit down, with meat the table of the outcasts. The silence. The atmosphere around us was different now. It wasn't one of disdain, but of uncertainty. Maria said nothing. She simply began to eat her watery porridge, her presence beside me a wall stronger than concrete. That gesture, the simple act of her sitting down with me, was the first drop of humanity I'd received since my name was replaced by a number. It was a thread. Thin as a spider's web, but it was a thread. A faith it's not just about miracle, it's about the witness. It's about the only person in the world who sees your soul, not your crime. If you've ever felt the power of a single act of compassion, of someone who sat beside you when the rest of the world turned its back on you, you understand what I felt in that moment. If this story is touching your soul, if you believe in redemption found in the darkest places, please consider enjoy this video. And if you want to follow this journey of justice and faith, sign upon our channel. Each subscription is a reminder that these stories matter, that no voice should be lost. Silence. That night, the barrier between us had broken. Silence. The cell was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken words. Finally, I asked her, "Why? Why did you sit with me? You heard what they say." Maria took a long time to answer. She ran her thumb along the worn edge of her Bible. "I've been here for 22 years, she said, her voice low. "I came in here angry. I saw things that would make God weep. And then I saw you, night after night, stitching the air together. I thought you were crazy. I asked God to protect myself from your madness." She paused, and a single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. "But last night, I didn't hear madness. I heard the same pain I carry. I have a granddaughter out there, an addict like Sarah. Every night I pray that she finds peace." She looked at me. "Last night, you gave Sarah peace, what they call a curse. God showed me it was an answered prayer. She was no longer just a cellmate. She was the first disciple of Americal, which I didn't even understand. And that was scarier than any threat from Red. Mary's silent alliance changed everything. In the brutal ecology of prison neutrality doesn't exist. You are either hunter or prey, victim or protected. By sitting with me, Maria, with her 2 decades of survival and her quiet moral authority, removed me from the prey category. The open contempt I received transformed into something more complex, a cautious curiosity, tinged with fear. The women stopped calling me a witch aloud. Now they just observed. They saw me in the courtyard, sitting next to Maria, my fingers sometimes moving in the air, stitching together my silent prayers. Sarah, the young addict, kept her distance, but her eyes never left me. She was like a frightened animal that had been saved from a trap, without understanding who saved her or why. Prison, the entire body of people around me seemed to be holding their breath. This new dynamic did not go unnoticed by Red. Her power did not come from guards or rules. It came from fear and influence. And my faith, my miracle silent, she was creating a different kind of influence, one she couldn't control. I was passing the sewing workshop on my way to the laundry when she came out, blocking my path. The loud hum of the machines stopped behind her, her girls watching through the glass window. "So," she said, her voice low and dangerously sweet, very different from the growl she used before. "The baby killer." She found Jesus. Or was it the devil? I tried to look away. She put her hand on the wall, trapping me. The smell of industrial soap and sweat came from her. "I don't know what you did with the drug addict," she hissed, "and I don't care. But here, miracles don't come for free." I looked into his eyes, my heart pounding against my ribs. The fear was the same, but something in me had changed. I was no longer the terrified newcomer. It wasn't a miracle. It was a prayer, I said, my voice low but firm. Red laughed, a short, ugly sound. Prayer. Right. Listen. Which? I run this place. The girls here have needs. They need extra cigarettes, smuggled letters, peace of mind. She leaned closer. They think you can... to repair things. So you're going to fix things for me. I have a girl in solitary confinement. She won't stop screaming. It's giving me a headache. Say your prayer and make her shut up. She was testing me, surrounding me, trying to turn my gift into a tool, a bargaining chip in her power game. It was Thebe Trail. The shelter is repeating itself. The director wanted a miracle maid to order for his son. Red wanted one to manage his block. Theslance. It stretched out. No, I said. The word was small, but it hung in the air. Red's sweetness evaporated. Her eyes narrowed. Wrong, she said. That wasn't a question. She gave me a sharp shove on the shoulder. You'll learn. 9 to 4, 5, 8, 2. Either you work for me or I'll show you what real witches are capable of. She turned and went back to the workshop, leaving me trembling in the hallway, realizing that my faith, I had just been dragged into a war that I didn't know how to fight. Red's revenge wasn't a physical attack. It was slower and more cruel. It was poisoning. The next morning, when I entered the cafeteria, silence. It was different. It wasn't curiosity. It was hostility. I saw Red sitting at her usual table, laughing loudly, surrounded by her followers. She watched me walk to the line. When Maria stood up to join me, Red called her name. Hey, Maria, old lady. We have a place for you here, away from the witchcraft. The entire cafeteria stopped. The air thinned. It was a public test, an order disguised as an invitation. Maria paused for a moment, her frail body seeming even smaller under the weight of 200 pairs of eyes. She looked at Red, then at me. Then, without a word, she turned her back on Red and stood beside me in line. A collective sigh swept through the hall. Red's face hardened, the feigned cheerfulness vanishing like a mask. She said nothing more, but the verdict had been given. The rest of the day was a silent hell. No one spoke to us. If we sat on a bench in the courtyard, the other prisoners would stand up. If we joined a queue, they would leave a meter of empty space around us. We were lepers, the witch and her disciple. Prison, he had excommunicated us. I could see the cost of Maria's loyalty in her slumped shoulders, in the way she pressed her Bible against her chest. I'm sorry, Maria, I whispered, as we stood alone in a corner of the windswept courtyard. I brought you trouble. She glanced at the barbed wire atop the wall, her eyes distant. Trouble, she snorted softly. I've been here 22 years for killing a man who nearly beat me to death. Red is nothing but noise. She turned to me. You did the right thing. What God gave you isn't for services. It's not a currency for buying favors. It's faith and faith. There's always a price. But I saw the trembling in her hands. She was afraid, for me and for herself. The real retaliation came 2 days later. I was in the laundry room, the hot steam and the smell of bleach filling my lungs. I was folding sheets, the repetitive rhythm almost meditative. Suddenly, an alarm sounded, a surprise inspection. Guards burst into the room, yelling for us all to line up against the wall. Hands on the wall! Hands on the wall! The head guard, a burly woman who had a clear alliance with Red, walked straight to my station. She reached under my folding table. What do we have here, 94582? She pulled out an object, an improvised knife made from a melted toothbrush with a razor blade stuck in the end. My blood ran cold. That's not mine, I said, my voice a whisper. I've never seen this before. Red, who was working on the other side of the room, grinned. They all say that, the guard barked. 2 weeks on sec, so you learn not to mix your hobbies with the work. Himself, segregation. Solitary confinement. Thebe betrayal. It was so obvious, so blatant. As they handcuffed me and led me out of the room, I saw Red's look. It was a look of triumph. I wasn't being punished for my crime. I was being punished for my faith. The heavy metal door of the solitary confinement cell slammed shut. Total darkness, silence. A silence I hadn't heard since I arrived. The worst cell was the one I built myself. But this one was real, cold, and it was the price of my integrity. The solitary confinement cell door doesn't just close, it sucks in the air, the light, and the time. The hole, they called it. And it was. A cold, concrete coffin 5 meters long and 2 meters wide. In the first hours, or perhaps the first day, Thessalon's, it was an assault. It was so absolute I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears, a wet, terrifying rhythm. The darkness was total. Not the soft darkness of night. It was a heavy, thick darkness that pressed against my eyes. I crawled to a corner and sat down, hugging my knees, the cement floor stealing the warmth from my body. The smell was of nothing. Stale air, the faint chemical smell of the toilet, and the metallic smell of my own fear. Time stopped passing. It just accumulated, like dust in a closed room. No sun, no counting, no clang from the doors of the building. My body didn't know when to sleep or wake up. I was just consciousness. And in the darkness, memory asks no permission. The darkness became a screen. I saw my baby's face, the face of the principal's dead son, Red's smiling face as the knife was found. Betrayal, a loss, an injustice. The cold began to seep into my bones. This was where I would die. This was where the witch would be extinguished, forgotten in a stone box. Despair was a physical thing, a chilling nausea. And then, through the concrete, I heard it. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a vibration. The rhythmic, desperate sobbing of another woman. It was coming from the cell next to mine. It was the cry Red wanted me to silence, the woman she ordered me to fix with my prayer. She wasn't screaming. She was falling apart, a sound of pure agony. I dragged myself to the wall that separated us. I pressed my forehead against the cold concrete. Her crying seemed to come from inside my own skull. "I can't stop you," I whispered to the stone. "I can't fix you." I raised my hands in the darkness, trembling, my tools. In that moment, I made a choice. I wouldn't pray for her pain to stop. I would pray that she wouldn't feel it alone. I pulled the thread. My grandmother's blue thread. The thread, she said, was woven with the faith of the ancestors. In my mind, it glowed in the darkness, and I began to sew. I pushed the invisible needle into the concrete. I sewed through the stone, through the loneliness, through the punishment. I sewed my tears to hers. I sewed mine loss has lost her. I wasn't trying to silence her, like Red wanted. I was trying to build a bridge. That's when I understood miracle. The director of the shelter and Red. They thought the gift was a can about the others. They were wrong. It was a path through pain. What killed the baby wasn't poison. It was the pure, concentrated pain in my tears, a pain that such a small body couldn't bear. But here, between two broken souls, that same pain wasn't poison. It was communion. I stitched for hours, maybe days. The crying in the next cell subsided, turning into a soft sigh. They threw me into the darkest place, prison, thinking of erasing me. But they forgot. The faith sewing is better in the dark. The sound of the key in the solitary confinement cell lock is different. It's not the clang the end of the prison. It's a reluctant creak, like a tomb being opened after an eternity. The corridor light hit me like a physical blow. My eyes burned, involuntary tears streaming down my dirty face. I was weak, my knees trembling. 2 weeks, or maybe 3. Time had no form in that concrete vacuum. The guard pulled me out roughly. "Stand up, 94582. Your time in the hole is up." She shoved me forward, and as she locked the door behind me, the door to the cell next to mine swung open. Another hunched figure was pulled out. It was the woman who had been crying. Our eyes met for a single, dizzying second. Her face was swollen, ravaged, but her eyes were calm. She was exhausted, but the agony had vanished. She gave me a single, slow nod, a silent acknowledgement. She knew. She knew that somehow, in the darkness, I had been there with her. Going back to the parade grounds was like emerging from underwater after nearly drowning. The noise, the smells, the colors, everything was sharp, too loud, too bright. Thessalence. The solitary confinement cell was still clinging to me like a second skin. I saw Maria. She was standing near the door of our cell, her small body taut as a wire. When she saw me, the tension released her in a gasp. She ran to me, faster than I'd ever seen her move, and caught me before my knees buckled. "They didn't break you," she whispered in my hair, her voice thick with emotion. She carried me to the mess hall to get afternoon food, her thin body acting as a shield. Across the hall, I saw Red. She was watching. Her face wasn't one of triumph, it was one of confusion. She threw me in the hole to destroy me, to make me obey. But the woman she wanted silenced was quiet. And I was standing, protected by the most respected woman in the block. I had failed to obey, but the outcome she wanted happened anyway. Thebe Trail. Her story had failed, and now she didn't know how to process it. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by something new. Uncertainty. That night, in the safety of my bunk, with Maria pretending to sleep below, I touched the cold wall. I wasn't afraid anymore. Thebe Trail from the director, the injustice, from the courtroom. Everything started to make a terrible and painful sense. The volunteer didn't know yet. Nobody knew. Butuai knew. That gift? It was real, and it was dangerous. What killed the headmistress's baby wasn't chemical poison. It was my tears. I remembered that day. I was sewing clothes for him, the blue thread running through my fingers, and I was crying. But I wasn't crying for the child. I was crying for myself. I was crying for loss from my own son, the terror of the border, the fear of a new world, the overwhelming loneliness. I poured my darkest, most concentrated pain onto the blue thread, and it was too much for such a young soul. Themerical, the power that calmed the woman in solitary confinement, a shared communion of grief, was the same power that, unchecked, took the life of that baby. I wasn't the murderer they portrayed, but I wasn't innocent either. The truth was much more complicated, and who would believe a witch who sewed with tears? Mine. Redemption. It wasn't just about proving my innocence to the world. It was about learning to control a gift that could heal or kill. Ben's visit was like throwing a stone into a sleeping lake. Prison. I could feel the ripples all over. The waiting was the worst part. Worse than solitary confinement, worse than betrayal. Red. The solitary confinement cell was asylance empty. That was asylance full of echoes, of possibilities, of futures I didn't dare imagine. Each clang. The sound of the door from the building made my heart pound. Each call on the intercom was a potential sentence, freedom or confirmation of my grave. Maria watched me with an almost maternal concern. "You have to breathe, girl," she said, placing her wrinkled hand on mine. "Hope is a wild bird. Don't try to cage it, just let it sing." But my bird was beating its wings against my ribs, desperate to escape. Then the day arrived. 94582, visit, attorney. The guard used the word attorney with a hint of respect that hadn't been there before. I was led into the same small room. Ben was there, but he wasn't the same. He wasn't nervous or scared. He was stunned. The table in front of him didn't have a stack of papers. It had just a single, thin folder. He waited for the door to close. "Elina," he said, his voice almost a whisper. The lab tests came back. I sat down, my hands cuffed so tightly to the table that my knuckles turned white. "They didn't find anything," Ben said, looking at the file as if he couldn't believe what he was reading. "No chemicals, no toxins, no poison, nothing the prosecution alleged. The lab was baffled. They said the case should never have gone to trial based on that." A sigh escaped me, a sound that seemed to come from someone else. Innocent. The word flashed through my mind, but Ben's face was still tense. "But," I asked, What killed the baby? Ben looked up from the report. There was something they couldn't identify. They said the blue thread, just the blue thread, was saturated with a complex saline protein and biological residue. They said the concentration was medically impossible. They had no idea what it was. Silence. The noise in the room was deafening. Miracle. It had a scientific name now. It was a biological residue. Ben leaned forward. Elina. The report said, composition consistent with human tears, highly concentrated. Human tears, the secret I kept for years, the pain I wove in the darkness, the faith from my grandmother. Now it was in a lab report in cold black letters. Ben looked at me, no longer like a kind volunteer, but like a man who had just seen a ghost. What does this mean, Elina? How is this possible? And what does this mean? He did. What did you do? It was the same question Maria had asked that night. But now, the world of logic and law was asking. I took a deep breath. Betrayal from the director, the injustice, from my judgment. Everything depended on this moment. It was time to confess, not the crime, but the gift. I cried, Ben, I said, the words coming out trembling, but clear. I was sewing the clothes for him, and I cried. I was mourning for loss from my own son, who was taken from me. I poured all my pain into that thread. I looked at my hands on the table. Where I was born, we believe that tears are a prayer, that faith can be stitched together. I was praying. I didn't know that my pain could hurt. The confession hung in the sterile air of the room. What killed the baby wasn't poison. It was my suffering. Ben fell silent. A long, heavy silence filled the small room. He didn't look at me with pity, nor with horror. He looked at me with the utter bewilderment of a man whose understanding of the world has just been permanently shattered. He rubbed his face with his hands, a gesture of profound exhaustion. Tears, he repeated, the words sounding absurd under the fluorescent light. Elina? The lab confirmed it. Tears. The original medical examiner never tested for that. He looked for poison, didn't find it, and the prosecution, pressured by the director, accepted chemical exposure as the cause, even without evidence. He looked at me. This is yours. Freedom. The basis of his condemnation. The poison doesn't exist. A wave of relief so strong washed over me that I almost fell out of my chair. Freedom. The word I didn't dare to think, but Ben's face was still grim. No, I said, my newfound terror growing. What is it? You said it's my freedom. He shook his head, organizing his thoughts. Legally, yes. It's the basis for a new trial. We can prove there was no poison. But Elina? The prosecution will ask, if it wasn't poison, what killed the child? The new coroner's report will say, cause undetermined, with a note about an anomalous biological residue. That opens a door. He leaned in. And what are we going to say? What you? Will you tell me in court when they ask what happened? Silence. What followed was my response. I couldn't tell the truth. The betrayal original director's work, transforming my faith into witchcraft. Now, that would make even more sense to a jury. I would be the witch who killed a child with a curse of tears. Ben understood my hesitation. Exactly, he said. The system of justice not prepared for miracles dark. They can't process a gift that comes from pain. He closed the folder. His voice became firm, the voice of a lawyer, not a confused volunteer. So, this is what we're going to do. We're going to stick to the facts. The facts. Cool. The fact is, there was no poison. The fact is, the prosecution withheld or ignored the first negative report from the laboratory. The fact is, their judgment was based on speculation and prejudice, not science. He looked at me intently. Let's not talk about tears. Let's not talk about prayers. Let's talk about the injustice from your first trial. To the world, Elina, you will not be freed because of on a miracle. You will be released because of a procedural error. The irony was bitter as gall. To have my freedom, I would have to hide the deepest part of myself. Faith, I would have to allow my gift to remain in the shadows, misunderstood, still feared. Our redemption, legally required, silent spiritual. I nodded, my relief mixed with a newless I would be free, but my gift would remain a prison. Do it, I said. Ben relaxed a little. Good, but there's one last problem. The person who convinced them you were a witch in the first place, the director of the shelter, Anna. Her testimony about your rituals is what sealed your fate. She poisoned the jury against you before the trial even began. He stood up. I can prove there was no poison, but I need something to neutralize her hatred. I need to find out why she lied. Returning to the cell block after learning there was a way to the freedom, it was the strangest torture I've ever experienced. Prison? It hadn't changed, but I had. The smell of bleach, the clang from the doorways, the empty stairs, everything seemed thin, like a veil I could see through. Hope was a poison worse than Red's accusation. It made me sick with anxiety. Maria sensed it. Now comes the hard part, she whispered to me in the courtyard as we watched Red play cards with his team. Waiting for the world of men to move. God is quick, Elina. A justice. It's slow. Red watched me. She knew something had changed. The volunteer kept coming back. The witch had a protector outside. The power in the block was in flux, and that was dangerous. I stopped stitching in the air. My hands were still. My faith, it was now in Ben's hands, locked in a file in his office. It was a feeling of helplessness that mirrored my first days there. The wait was over. I was called again. Lawyer. The word sounded solid now. I entered the room, and Ben was there. He didn't seem dazed, like last time, nor nervous, like the first. He seemed profoundly sad. The exhaustion of a man who dug too deep and didn't like what he found. I went to see you, Elina, he said, without preamble. I went to see Anna, the director of the shelter. My stomach churned. The betrayal, the woman who put me here, who pointed her finger and called me a murderer. I haven't confronted her with the lab report yet, Ben said. I needed to understand. I needed to know the... Why? Why would she lie with such conviction? I waited. Thessalon's. The room buzzed with noise. I found her at her house, Ben said, looking at his own hands. The shelter went bankrupt after the scandal. She lives alone. The baby's room. It's still there, exactly as it was. He took a deep breath. I told her I was reviewing refugee cases that had suffered from language barriers. And I asked about you. And she broke down. She cried for 10 years. But it wasn't tears of hatred, Elina. It was guilt. Blame. The word struck me. She told me the baby was sick, Ben continued, his voice low. A fever that wouldn't go away. The doctors were at a loss. She was exhausted, terrified. She told me, I prayed to God for a miracle, and I asked Elina for one. I didn't know that. She never told me he was sick. She just said, make him some clothes, protective clothing. Ben continued, and his words painted a picture that chilled my blood. The night before he died, Anna had been awake for 48 hours. She decided to take a shower just for 5 minutes. She left the baby in the crib. When she came back, he wasn't breathing. He was blue. My God. She revived him. She did CPR. He came back, but she knew Elina. She knew she had made a terrible mistake. She, the perfect director, the saint of the shelter, had almost killed her own son through exhaustion. Ben looked at me. When the baby died the next morning, putting on your clothes, it was a salvation for her. She was drowning in guilt. And I, with my strange prayers, my blue thread, my language she didn't understand, I was the perfect scapegoat. She didn't accuse me out of hatred. She accused me to survive her own loss. An injustice. It wasn't an act of malice. It was an act of desperation. The gift God gave me was mistaken for a curse, not because it was evil, but because the woman who judged it already felt cursed by her own failing. Prison. It was built on the guilt of another mother. I absorbed Ben's words. Blame, neglect, fear. The monster that haunted me for a decade wasn't a monster. It was just another mother, broken by grief, who made a terrible mistake and used my faith as a shield to hide their own flaw. Injustice. It hurt in a new way. It was no longer the sharp cut of hatred, but the dull pain of empathy. I understood what it was like to carry a loss so heavy it could crush you. She hid her guilt. I hid mine. Miracle. We were both in a prison. Hers, perhaps, was worse. What do we do now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What? Justice. What do you do when everyone else is broke? Ben closed his briefcase. The sadness in his eyes was replaced by a cold determination. Now, he said, we use the truth, all of it. He stood, pacing the small room. Your hearing for a new trial is scheduled for next week. The prosecution will fight. They'll try to suppress the new lab report. They'll paint Anna as a grieving victim and you as an exotic, ritual practitioner. And he stopped and looked at me. But now I have two weapons. Weapon number 1, the lab report proving there was no poison. It's the scientific proof. He slapped the briefcase. Weapon number 2, Anna's confession. I looked at him, confused. She didn't confess to you unofficially. Ben smiled, a humorless smile. No, but she will. I'll see her again. I'll present her with the lab report. I'll show her that the poison lie is over. And then I'll offer her a deal. An agreement? The prosecution doesn't know about her negligence, Ben explained. They don't know she left the baby alone. If this comes to light, Anna will no longer be a grieving victim. She will be a criminal. She will be prosecuted for negligence, maybe manslaughter. She will lose everything. He was showing me the brutal mechanism of justice. I'm going to offer her a choice, Ben said. She can go to court and testify. In favor, from my motion, telling the truth, that she was exhausted, that she doesn't know what happened, that she panicked, and that she used you as a scapegoat because of your practices off faith. Or I'll file a negligence complaint against her with the prosecutor's office. It was a cruel move. It was betrayal against betrayal. It was to use loss. I used hers the way I used mine, as a weapon. I didn't feel triumph. I only felt a deep weariness that came from the soul. My grandmother's blue thread, a thread of faith and miracle, it was being used to blackmail a broke woman. This was their redemption. Was this the face-off freedom? Is she going to do it? I asked. Ben nodded. She will, because she's been living with this guilt for 10 years. Deep down he wants confess. I'm just giving her the only reason the law understands. He placed his hand on the glass separating us. Get ready, Elina. You're going to get out of this place. But it won't be pretty. A justice, it rarely is. I hadn't been in a courtroom since the day my name was replaced by a number. The air was the same, polished wood, dust, and the faint smell of fear. But this time, I wasn't alone. Ben was beside me, no longer a volunteer, but a lion. His papers were neatly organized. Across the room, the prosecutor looked bored, as if this were an irritating formality. And then, in the front row of the gallery, I saw her. Anna, the director. She looked 20 years older. She didn't look at me. She just stared at the state seal on the wall behind the judge, as if praying to it. The judge has read the records, Mr. Carter, the prosecutor said, his voice full of scorn. The prisoner was convicted by a jury. This motion for a new trial based on new interpretations is a waste of the court's time. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, looked at Ben. Mr. Carter, do you have anything more than interpretation? Ben stood up, calm, solid. Yes, Your Honor. We have facts. He presented the new lab report. The basis of the original conviction was poisoning by toxic chemicals. This report, from a certified forensic laboratory, conclusively proves there was no poison, of any kind. A murmur swept through the room. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, this is a trick. The key witness? The judge banged his gavel. Silence. The key witness is here. He looked at Ben. That's a serious allegation, Mr. Carter. Are you saying the prosecution was wrong? I'm saying the prosecution didn't have a case, Your Honor, said Ben. They had a grieving witness and a defendant who didn't speak the language. And now I'd like to call that witness, Anna Williams. The heir left the room. Anna walked to the witness stand as if she were going to the gallows. Her face was pale. Ben was gentle. He didn't attack her. He guided her. Ms. Williams, you testified in 2014 that you believed Elina had used chemicals on a suit, chemicals that killed your son, correct? Yes, I believed it, she whispered. Ben placed the lab report in front of her. This report proves there were no chemicals. There was no poison. Your son was not poisoned. Anna looked at the paper, and then she looked at me. For the first time in 10 years, our eyes met. The hatred had vanished. There was only loss. No, said Anna, her voice gaining strength. No, he didn't go. The prosecutor shouted, Objection! The witness is— Shut up, growled the judge. Continue, Mr. Carter. Anna, Ben said softly. If it wasn't poison, why did you tell the jury that Elina was a witch? Why did you say she practiced dark rituals? Anna began to cry. An ugly cry born from a decade of guilt. My baby was sick, she confessed to the court. I was exhausted. I left him. I left him alone in the crib to take a shower, and when I came back, he was blue. The room choked. I brought him back, but he was weak. He died the next morning, and I knew it was my fault. I left him. She was sobbing now, looking at the judge, at me, at anyone who would forgive her. And she, Elina, she gave me that outfit, with her strange prayers, her blue thread. It was easier to blame the miracle. It was easier to call her that than my own failure. Witchcraft, rather than calling me a negligent mother. I needed a monster, or else I would be the monster myself. Silence. What followed was absolute. The betrayal. He was naked, exposed. It wasn't malice. It was just human pain, twisted and ugly. The judge looked at the prosecutor, whose face was white. Do you have anything to say, prosecutor? The man just shook his head, defeated. The judge banged the gavel, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Given the new evidence and the perjury of the key witness, the original conviction is overturned. Prisoner 94582. Elina, you are free. Book. The word had no sound. It had no weight. It was just air. The handcuffs were removed. The guards who dragged me inside didn't touch me on the way out. I walked down the corridor, my worn-out shoes, prison making a soft sound on the marble. Ben held the front door of the courtroom open. The sunlight hit me. It was warm. Really warm, not the pale rectangle of light on the wall of my cell. And the smell. It wasn't bleach or metal or despair. It smelled of bus exhaust, of street food, of trees. It smelled of life. I stopped on the sidewalk, and for the first time in 10 years, I breathed. The air filled my lungs, and with it came such a sharp pain, a loss so deeply affected by that stolen time, that my knees almost gave way. Ben stayed by my side. He didn't touch me. He gave me space to emerge. What are you going to do now, Elina? He asked, his voice gentle. I looked at my hands. They were free. Pale, with light scars, but free. They no longer needed to stitch the air. I thought of Maria, still inside, who had given me her protection. I thought of Anna, who would now face her own kind of justice. And I thought about my gift. The world out there still didn't understand it. They didn't know about the tears. They only knew about the procedural error. My redemption, it was legal, not spiritual in their eyes. But I knew. God didn't take me out of the cell. He found me inside it. He taught me the weight of my gift, the price of faith. My name is Elina, and I am free. I lost my son. I lost a decade of my life, and I was called a murderer by Americal, which was misinterpreted. But the blue thread, it never broke. It grew stronger in the dark. Apperson wasn't the end of my story. It was the place where I learned to sow with my own soul. Freedom, it's not the absence of walls. It's the courage to hold on to your gift, even when the world calls it a curse. Sometimes, God doesn't open the cell. He changes who we are inside. We want to know how this story touched you. Please, leave a comment below. Tell us what your blue thread is, that quiet faith or that pain that defines you. Or simply tell us which country and city you are connecting with us from. Your voice matters here. If you believe these journeys of faith and justice need to be told, sign upon our channel. Each subscription is a reminder that no soul should be forgotten. And finally, share this story as about someone who needs to remember that even silence can be redemption.